I think we can get started. I would encourage you to move in towards the center, give us a more intimate feel. In fact, if you wanted to kind of curve around some of these seats, I would like. There's not too many of us this evening yet. Maybe some more people will come.
Yeah, I can't hear.
Come on in. Hi, I'm good. So this is the third of 3 meetings that your government is putting on this week.
That's a good one.
The first meeting was on Monday night. Many of you, though not all, I can see, were in attendance. And it was an opportunity for me to just kind of give a history and a background of why we developed the form-based zoning code, the process that was involved, the different players, stakeholders, and how we kind of got to where we are as of Monday night. Last night, many of you attended the Borough Caucus meeting and had an opportunity to, I hope, hear each of your council members discuss in detail how they felt about the draft code that is up for discussion and where they stand on it. And I hope you heard a good intellectual debate. I was very impressed at the depth to which each council member has read the document and has issues, problems. I called them, so you had your showstoppers, and then you had your tweaks and your nice-to-haves. In many ways, the document has a framework and a structure, and then there comes the style portion. You know, the parts that maybe reasonable people could agree that the number could go either way. I would prefer it to be a 1, you would prefer it to be a 4, and so forth. Tonight is really, I'd like to hear from you. We can try and do, if you have questions, question and answer as best I can. Mr. Muderick is not with us tonight. I actually suggested that it would be better, I think, for the borough if he spent his time this evening working on some of the data requests that came out of last night's council meeting. Because I think the sooner that we can have data for the councilors to consider and to be available to all of you, the better this process will go. But I am blessed here to have Mr. Brassey and Mr. Cornwell. Anyone else from the Planning Commission here? Oh, Mr. Brower, there he is. Who I will defer to for technical answers. Hopefully, I'm not looking for this to be kind of opinions going at each other, but you know, if you want to know what's permitted in a 4A district, one of these guys is going to know better than me off the top of their head.
You think?
I do. So, that said, I guess we can get started. We can come up with a system here. Let's see. And I'll tell you, at the end of this meeting, I'm going to write a summary for all the council members, because there are no other ones here. Just from my perspective, I'm not taking notes. If you have a statement that you would like all of the councilors to see, I would email the borough office. You can CC all of the council members, or if it goes to the borough office, it will become part of the public record Monday night, and they will all see the letter that you sent with whatever you have to say in it. And you should always feel free to do that on any issue in the borough at any time. So why don't I kind of start on my left and see if anybody wants to break the ice. Ms. Fortner.
And this is just wanting more information. Last night, I don't remember who mentioned it, but that there's like a red line summary that's going to be on the SharePoint site that the borough uses. Can that be made available to us? Because I would love to see that. I didn't see it on, I looked about 5 o'clock and didn't see it.
Yes, it can. I think, in fact, I have it. And I'm not going to hand it out. And the only reason is because I think all of the council members found errors in it. And it is being revised. And I know that that is Ms. Van Dyke's task tomorrow to get that done. So that everyone, and I don't want to hand out something that is, you know, has numerous inconsistencies, but that, yes, will become available.
Okay, great, because I really don't relish reading all of the new code against all of the old code to see what has changed.
No, and I don't think anybody does. Coming around. Ms. Bizek.
I know that there has been mention of the fact that the Montgomery County Planning Commission or other experts collected parking data and used that data analysis to make recommendations regarding how parking, off-street parking requirements and such would be recommended. So I was just wondering if there would be an opportunity for, I don't know much about the GIS system, but if there would be an opportunity for Mr. Metric or someone with the skill set to maybe give us a brief presentation, like a snapshot of that data.
I think that the plan that I took away from last night's discussion for parking, there is that data. We're putting out an RFP very shortly for a parking study that would be done by a third-party consulting firm that will look at the entire borough. When you hear parking study, you're counting cars on the street, maybe traffic patterns, comings and goings. There's actually a lot more in there that has come up from some of the individuals. I'll say Councilor Cilio in particular has a lot of great ideas in regards to parking. Things like working with private landowners for shared lots. So for example, take the Citizens Bank lot. Maybe there can be meters there, and we can do a revenue share with Citizens Bank, reserving a certain number of spaces for their needs. So there's a lot of things that would be involved in that study. I think that we also talked last night about resource allocation and how Mr. Metric did an excellent job tracking the different things that everyone in the office does, categorizing them by hours per week, and then expanding that out to what does it look like, it's going to look like for the year, and how many hours are available for discretionary tasks. So you have the basic core functions that government has to do. We need to have people who can answer questions when you walk in. We need to be filing permits and responding to them, coordinating with the engineers. And we're hoping, with Mr. West's help, to implement technology that increases those discretionary hours. But right now, those discretionary hours are very few. And I think that if we did a presentation like that, it would probably be part of the kickoff of that parking study done by that third-party consultant to save those resources in the office. That's my take on it. I don't know if that's a good answer.
I wasn't here last night, so I could have very easily missed this information.
Sure,
If
no problem.
If I'm repeating
No,
what's
go ahead.
I apologize. As I look at the zoning, there's one part that I really don't understand. I don't understand why they would change the zoning on South Narberth, North Narberth, and North Essex so that those beautiful Victorian or stately homes would be able to be knocked down and made into flat roof apartment buildings. There are several homes, and that's the one thing that I don't understand why that is changing.
Okay. I'm going to give my answer, and then I think maybe one of the Planning Commission members can discuss in a little more detail what their thinking was.
Okay.
When they my understanding, so we'll kind of hear a contrast, is that the goal is to zone for what exists versus having zoning that doesn't match what is on the ground right now. So by making, say, that area of South Narberth or North Essex yellow, that allows for apartment buildings, it recognizes that if you were to walk down that block today, it feels like a block that has a number of apartment buildings on it. There are homes on there also, and we've heard a lot of community discussion about that it would put those homes under pressure to be torn down and developed. One of the things that the form-based code does is it applies these form-based standards in terms of how much of the lot can be consumed by the building envelope. It really reduces the amount of building that can exist in any of the lots if there was a tear down and a rebuild. And in doing so, disincents someone from doing just that. It encourages someone to maybe rehab, say it's a stately Victorian, and it's no longer going to be a single family residence. Maybe it's been, who knows, people buy properties, they can do what they, right? It would encourage them to maybe convert it into a family, 3 entrances, and break it up into kind of an apartment, keeping what you see from the street basically the same, versus demolishing that structure and trying to build an apartment, because the costs wouldn't turn into the number of units that they would need to get to really make it a profitable enterprise. That's my take on it. Mr. Bresci, maybe?
I think our council president has said it pretty well. The goal of the code in many areas is to disincentivize changing what's here now. In order to build an apartment building, you have to have a pretty big piece of property. You can't have a little flat, your characterization, a flat roofed apartment building of 3 or 4 stories on a tiny lot, with just a little
Which
grass
is
strip
what
around.
exists now in many of these lots.
Right, so in order to do another apartment building, you're going to have a lot of land.
Right.
Very difficult to assemble that. Not impossible, very difficult. More economically attractive to a developer would be to buy that house that for some reason is on the market. Maybe it's because it's too big. We see that a lot from coast to coast in America, houses that are too big for the people that love them and live in them to maintain them. Many of us, as we age, face that with our medium-sized houses, and let alone a magnificent big Victorian house. So, what to do with this beautiful old house? Well, one idea is to carve it up into 3 units or something like that. Maintain the quality, the architectural quality, the look and feel. I keep using the word look and feel because it's very important to this code. To maintain that look and feel of the neighborhood, while offering to the structure a new life, to be something other than what it is now. Right now, it's a single-family house. We love it. We want to walk by and see it in perpetuity. So, a way to give it a new life is to allow it to be converted into 2 units or 3 units.
But
or
there are
something
a couple of them that are already 3 units or
Right.
4 units.
Right, and that's typical of 3 streets in town. South Narberth Avenue, North Narberth Avenue, and Essex Avenue on the north side. Those happen to be streets that have that where the buses are, on the north side anyway, and that are best able to handle the traffic, the trips. A traffic consultant used the word trips. In order to carry that volume of traffic. It's certainly true if you can go from Bowman all the way to across the bridge. When the bridge is reconstructed, it will be much safer. And up and down the streets on the north side. Those streets are sized for 2-way traffic without a problem and handle it better. So if you have more people living on those streets, there will be less traffic issues there. That's another aspect.
Does that? Well, I just want to. So give me your feedback. Like you heard an answer.
I don't know, I must be stupid because I said it I'm really sorry.
No, I
Can I say something? I don't believe that's true.
Well,
I think, okay.
I'd like to get to that.
It
Okay.
seems to me that it would, so you're saying that, let me just repeat what I think you're saying. You're saying to me that those properties that have been changed zoning are not really large enough to build a flat roof apartment building. Is that what you're saying?
I'd have to look at the map, as you just said.
Because some of those.
Typically so.
Okay, well, how about if okay, so I'm trying to think if any are next door to each other where they can buy both of them, but I don't think they are.
Excuse me, can I just
Yes.
have this?
Yes, that would be good.
Same neighborhood. My next door neighbor has a double lot. I said to her this afternoon, please give me 6 months' notice if this code goes through, give me 6 months' notice so I can sell my house before the developer buys your house, knocks it down, and puts a big apartment building there.
Okay.
And I don't understand what you said, something about more cars will make less traffic. You just said something.
I think
That's what I said.
Exactly.
I said that some of our streets can carry more traffic than others. And when you look at the map, when you look at the points that are connected by these roads, if you were going to have a high-density housing, you wouldn't want to bury it down on Rockland Road, Rockland Avenue, or something like that. You'd want it to be on a street that has the capacity to carry the volume. And
But I think there's another point which Jim made about where these yellow zones are, is that they're designed to be in areas where public transit is kind of right there.
Okay.
So that the idea being that
Public
although you
transit
may
south
increase
of
the number of people, let's just say, over time, you are encouraging that those people are more likely to have fewer vehicles.
Okay, that's not even the part that I'm concerned about. I'm concerned about the beautiful homes with a lot of, with property and trees and grass and everything. And if a developer came in would he be able to knock that one house down? Like, let's just pick one, like the one on, say, on the
So-
corner
Well,
of...
let's talk about the one on Narberth Avenue that's been obviously disarray.
But they can't-
Across the street from the church.
They can't build an apartment.
That's not in that zone.
That's, yeah.
But I'd be happy to cycle back and give you some background on that.
Now, I'm thinking of the properties that seem large. I don't know, are they large enough to build an apartment building there? Let's say the one on Meridian and South Narberth, or the one on Chestnut and South Narberth.
So one of the things that, because I've heard a lot of these questions.
Would they be allowed to be knocked down and made into an apartment?
Probably not. Probably not. I don't know the property intimately. Todd is looking up the map. The goal here.
I'm sorry, this is getting good. Everybody wants to say something. Let me just make one point. In Pennsylvania, we cannot, as a borough, there's things we can't do. We can't just say no properties can be torn down or no pretty Victorians can be. So we have an envelope that we have to operate in.
That I understand.
Right.
That makes
And I
sense.
think part of what the Planning Commission and a form-based code tries to do is do the best job we can in the envelope we are permitted to operate in. With that said, Todd, I think may be able to.
The apartment building would be allowed to be there. Go ahead.
One reason for doing that is that there are already apartment buildings on that street.
Okay, two apartment buildings, that's true.
And one of the things we don't want to do is pass a zoning code which makes an existing building illegal or non-conforming. And so one of the things we have to think about
So,
is can we develop a zone that allows the apartment buildings that are already there to be legal?
okay, but you can't just grandfather them in, or you can't just keep zoning, you have
Yeah,
to
you
zone the
can.
whole street?
You're never going to get zone. How many only
You
finish
could
bases?
always grandfather something in.
Well, let's let Todd finish, and then Alexander has something to
It's-
say. And we'll
That's
make that
not the way that professional planning works. You don't create zones that make things illegal so that things that are already there can be grandfathered in. That's not the purpose of writing a zoning code. It's bad practice for your municipality to write a law that makes buildings illegal, even if they can be grandfathered in. It's like a principle of planning. It's like banking or accounting. You just have certain rules you follow.
Okay,
So
so,
that's
Alexandra?
one thing. Please let me finish. So knowing that a goal was to allow apartment buildings on those streets to be legal, we also realized that we don't want to create a situation where people will rush to tear them down. So what you have to look at is not just the land use, but you have to look at the rules that say how much of a lot you need and what you can do with that lot.
right, yeah.
The way the rules are written is you pretty much would have to, except for a larger lot, I think it's 8,000 square feet, you'd have to start assembling lots. But once you start assembling lots, it's designed to be very inefficient economically. If you assemble a lot, I think the break point is 7,500 square feet. Every lot you add after that, you only get to use 8% of that lot for building. So the cost of assembling the land would be so high to be able to build a building that it's just not economically feasible.
Okay.
So it's a way of denying that developer the right, without outright saying, without
Without doing it outside of the envelope.
Because that one lot is not enough square feet,
Right.
is that what you're saying?
so effectively you prohibit him without prohibiting him.
You need an 8,000 square foot lot to build an apartment building.
I think
Okay.
there are 10
But when you
lots.
look at the rules that say how much of a lot can a building cover? How far does it have to be set back? How high can it be? When you do the math, we modeled these buildings on all those lots in South Narberth Avenue. When you do the math, it becomes very, very economically infeasible to build an apartment building. Because the cost of the land, the cost of demolition, the cost of reconstruction is much, much higher than the cost of reusing that house. So we understand that people don't want a zone where houses will be torn down and turned into apartments.
Right. I
But
see.
we also understand that buildings that are apartments have to be made legal. So we try to develop dimensional criteria
I see.
that would really, really discourage this from happening. Is it to say that it could never happen? Well, no. It could happen one day, but a lot of things could happen one day. I have to say that the first thing that happens is a property owner, who's one of the neighbors, sells their house to a developer. I mean, that in America is a right you have. You can sell your house. We can't stop people from doing certain things like that.
All right.
Except by writing code that makes it economically unappetizing.
Thank you, Todd.
Yes, I'd like to say
Manager, go
You
ahead.
sound very sure that this is economically unfeasible. I don't believe it is. I think there are about 10 properties on South Narberth, North Narberth, and North Essex Avenue that are large enough to be turned into apartment buildings. One problem is you've got an unlimited number of units allowed in the apartment buildings, as opposed to right now, the limit is 3 units per building. So I think there is an incentive. I don't know why you have unlimited number of units, but I think that should be changed. If you're going to do this, that should be absolutely changed. I don't, and the other thing is I've seen the build-outs, and the build-outs are definitely larger than the existing house in many cases. Now, just take the example of North Essex Avenue. There's a beautiful stick-style Victorian there with a garage. If you take the setbacks on either side of that house, you come up with quite a large piece of that property, if I'm reading it right, that could be built on. And I'm not sure that I'm right. I'm just saying that's just from what I'm looking at.
Okay.
And that would be a very appealing property, because with an unlimited number of units, you could get a lot of money out of that property. So there is an incentive, especially, I don't know how many of those properties are actually, and give enough incentive for a developer, but I suspect quite a few of them, maybe not all 10, but I think that you should look at that again, because I don't think that the disincentives outweigh the incentives. I do not believe so. And I think that there's a lot of money to be made from renting a lot of units as opposed to 3 or 4.
Okay, I wrote those down. I have some thoughts, but I actually want to hear more from other people, and then I'll cycle back.
I think if I'm right, this is about bulk. That is what you can do now. I probably live in one of the 10 properties talking about on North Essex. And I know when I bought the property that I basically signed in blood outside of the contract that I would never allow it to be sold to anybody but a family. And we will never sell to anybody but a family. But, people can do whatever they want. I'd like to think that we could put that in a sales contract, but I will try to do that. But that's not what's on the table right now. I think what's on the table is, right now, I can tear down my house and make something at least twice as big and still fall within the limits of the zoning code. And that's a problem.
Yeah.
And if we have a new code that shrinks the bulk of what's possible there, then that's better.
But it's still big, isn't it?
Well,
I think it is.
Well, but we can't, as he said, the state, because I've been on the zoning board for 17 years, and so I see a lot of these cases. And the state, the Commonwealth in Harrisburg, the Supreme Court will not let you be too restrictive in how much of the land you can be developed. And part of this is driven exactly, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, with what's there right now. So when the whole idea is you're trying to make it as small as what's there, but you can't make it too small because it would make properties illegal. I think that's all part of this idea. Yeah, you could, if you could make it smaller, I think they would have done it. And it is a concern. I mean, I was happy that there were apartment houses on my block. My wife's not happy about the bus, but the bus is a lot quieter now than it was 10 years ago. But ultimately, what worries me is that the amount of bulk that can happen now with developers who are seeking out properties in Narberth because they can make a lot of money, if we reduce their window of opportunity of making a lot of money, then I think that's a good idea.
Yeah, just following up on that, what you're saying makes sense. I can't make sense of it being permitted for a developer to buy up 2 lots and then do the same thing. And, I'm thinking like between Chestnut and Marywood, for example, there are 2 really large houses side by side. Well, if a developer who knows at this point with current real estate values could come in there and get rid of those houses and build something significantly larger, I feel like we're just kind of giving it to them. So I'd like to know the justification for that part.
I don't think the math would favor them. I mean, going back to what Todd said, the profits to be had by having 2 big houses, I'm pretty sure is going to outweigh the profits to be had by combining 2 lots when you can only take advantage of a small
And I think
But
that,
why
I think that,
allow
there-
it
yes,
still?
well,
I mean, if we don't think it's going to happen and we can control that, why
I think
not?
because it's America.
Yeah.
Well,
It's
there are,
also Narberth,
well, there are certain things we cannot, going back to
Right,
what Aaron
but
said,
legally.
there are certain things we can't legally do.
So
we
is
could
that
not,
both
we could
of
not legally say people cannot combine lots to make a larger lot that would allow them a new use.
Because I think that adds a lot of incentive for developers.
So I think what Mr. Bressa said, that it was a little quiet, so maybe some of us in the front might have missed, was how if you were to combine 2 lots, and now you have a lot that allows you to build an apartment building, the percentage of that second lot that you can actually put a building on is, what was the percentage? 8%.
These are big lots.
Yes, I'm sorry. The percent, if you took 2 lots and you combine them, so now you can have an apartment building. The percentage of the second lot that is allowed to have a building on it is 8% of that lot. 8.
But,
That's a,
wait,
okay,
okay.
that's a very small percentage. So now you've combined, I mean, in some ways, if someone wanted to do it and they could find a way to make it profitable, it would increase the green space surrounding that apartment building to make it a lot more pleasant to be around. Or more likely, as Mr. Cornwell suggests, that they would rather rehab those 2 houses and flip them as homes because you could make more money doing that.
Well, what's the legality of saying you can only use a certain percentage of the second lot? Where's that?
Mr. Bressi, could you answer that question?
That is a basic principle in zoning, that you can regulate the amount of a lot that can be covered by a building. So
You can regulate the amount of the lot that can be covered.
We do that already.
Yeah, it's
In our current zoning, because we do that all the time. Every lot in Narberth has got setbacks and percentages that we can build on. This is,
Is that one
That's totally
building
different than adding
If
a
you-
second lot.
if
and
you
saying
took-
you only use a small percentage.
That's what I want to know. If you took 2 lots, put them together,
Why isn't it
and built
5%?
one, did you build one building on it?
Hold on, Alexander.
Say it.
I'll get you. Go ahead. You said, why not 5%? Why not
Why
15%?
not 1%?
Right, and
What's it
I will
cover?
defer to the planning commission.
But
I can't answer where it comes from. I just
Is that
don't have an encyclopedic memory of the
Is that a
discussion.
universal number, or are we making that up?
I think we derived that from standards that have been tried and true in other parts of the country. There was a lot of that went into this code. I can't speak tonight about what those sources were. I simply don't remember.
I'm
Can I
going
ask
to
a
address
question?
Alexandra's point.
I just want to ask a question. Okay, so if you took 2 lots, you put them together, if you only had the 1 lot, you'd have to set the apartment building back from all the different property lines,
Correct.
according to what is next to it or whatever. So if you had two lots, and could you have 1 building? And if so, that 1 building would actually extend right to the property line and go over it 8%. So you'd have quite a large building. You wouldn't have to set it back because it would be 1 building. And that 1 building would have to go into the other lot. So you wouldn't have a setback on that side.
There are still setbacks that apply. If you combine two lots and effectively erase the property line in the middle, so that you had now, instead of a square, you had a rectangle.
Right,
That's what you're imagining here.
yes.
And the building sits in there.
Right.
According to the rule that Todd is quoting, the percentage of the second lot cannot exceed 8%. That
Right.
is within the footprint of the new structure.
So you definitely could build
Right.
a slightly
But-
larger apartment
Yeah.
than if that first lot somehow permitted you,
Right.
but you don't get to just bulk it up.
Right.
No, but wouldn't it go all the way over to the property line and extend?
The
past
property line would not exist.
No, but imagine the former property
Former property
line.
line,
Okay,
sure.
it would go over to that former property line and extend over 8% into the
That's
other
correct.
property.
Right.
So basically, that would be a very large building if you had a large lot of 8,000 square feet.
That leads
And I think
into
that's-
some other
you should
questions that you
address
asked
that.
that
I mean,
I want to
that's-
address. Yes, you would be able to
That's
make
that's
a
big
larger,
building.
It would be
larger
larger
building.
than either of the houses it replaced.
Oh, yeah,
Yes.
quite a bit.
But it would be, so one of the other things that Alexandra asked that I would like to get to before I'm going to ask
Yeah.
Paul and Jeff next, he's been waiting very patiently. Why unlimited units? You said
Yes,
that, right?
right,
Why
yes,
unlimited units? And I'm going to set it up for our planning commission that there are other rules in the code that constrain the number of units. One of which we discussed last night, is the Universal Construction Code. The construction code doesn't allow us to build, 100 square foot apartments, right? It has certain minimum standards, but there are other requirements in terms of how much parking must be provided, et cetera, that will further constrain, and limits to how much parking can be in the front yard setback, whereas right now you can do that. What am I missing? That would further constrain the number of units.
Parking?
that
You
could
said
be built.
parking, I was eavesdropping on a conversation, I'm sorry.
Parking, and the Universal Construction Code limits on how big.
There are minimum property standards that are in the building code.
So even though our code doesn't have a number, it kind of references out to other things that, although it doesn't say it can't be this many units, each lot will have a formula, each building that would be presented as part of a plan, that would significantly limit the number of units.
So when it says unlimited, it doesn't mean 500. It means,
There's also a height standard. It can only be 35 feet, is that? It can only be 35 feet high.
what it means is the number of units that's permissible is as regulated by all the little niggling details that impose limits on what can be in the box. Parking.
Jeff?
Enumerated.
Jeff?
Going back to, there was some discussion today on Facebook, but going back to the original comment about South Narberth Avenue, not to make it only about that, but it's the area I live close to and know the best. Not that the other parts are just as important. There was, and we don't have it here in front of us, there was a build-out study done by Sean last year specifically to that avenue to see what is the max build-out possible. Does anyone on the planning commission remember what that number was?
Just for that street.
Just for that street. I believe it was
Not as
19 or 20.
back though. You make a lot of rabbit.
I'll tell you what, we give him a minute.
Yeah, give them a minute to answer that.
And then we'll swim down.
And then the comment on Facebook was, because there were many people, including, I don't know if the Ripley's are here tonight, but Ed and Cindy said, if we could just make that yellow area orange, a lot of the opposition from the south side neighbors, which we're hearing a lot of tonight, would probably say, yeah, you know what, everything else we can live with and we'll fix later, but they were really opposed to this idea of that yellow zone down South Narberth Avenue. I understand we're saying, well, planning says we need to be consistent. There's 2 apartment buildings. Those apartment buildings do not really stand out when you walk from one to the other. One is tucked away behind trees, right by the rails. You barely even know it because you see the bridge. The other one is all the way at the other end, right near Rockland Avenue and the castle that's on the Lower Merion side of South Narberth Avenue. Everything in between is beautiful homes, and it's a good, long 2-3 blocks of just big, stately homes that are either homes or multifamily. And that's where our concern is, the combining of lots and those being changed into something that becomes more like those 2 on either end. And we'd rather see it just all be orange and just not grandfather maybe that's the wrong word, but just say, hey, you know what? We're gonna put a yellow zone here and a yellow zone here, so if anybody ever knocked those down, they could rebuild a new apartment building. But everything in between doesn't necessarily have to follow those two specific buildings. And there's no time.
I'm just going to pause real quick. I notice a lot of you are cramming to here. So there's no reason this needs to be here. Can we make a little more of a semicircle? I think that would really help. Intense, but I Okay. Jeff had some comments. What's that?
Can you ask people to first say their names?
Yes, that's a great idea. You know, I didn't do that because it's not necessarily a council meeting. But if you could say your name and address, I think it would give everyone some perspective. That's a good point. Ms. Bezek.
Kimberly Bezak, sorry, 237 Dudley. I think it was Rick, I don't remember his last name, but he lived on the south side, he was a planner. He spoke last night to the fact that, just with what I've been hearing, the pattern that a planner would see existing on South Narberth and how zoning it yellow made sense because of that pattern. And then the other thing, if you could maybe describe that a little better for me, he was talking about how if you only did the apartment buildings in yellow, then it would be a case of spot zoning. So could you just speak to that a little more?
Mr. Brower's nodding. I'm going to give it to him.
Yeah, there's actually one case of that. If you look at the zoning plan, at the very northern tip of the borough, where Winwood Road meets, there's that one apartment building that just is stuck up there. And that was a place where we had to leave that little dot of yellow because we didn't think it was reasonable to try to find out those kind of connections, that Jim has talked about. And that was the one case where we felt that it was, we had to memorialize what was there without finding a greater logic of how it fit. With the other streets that we've been talking about, it was, we're just repeating ourselves, but it was the logic that's already been talked about. But I think the other thing that comes into it is when we set about to put together this new code, we're really thinking in a 50-year time frame. You don't, as we all know, you don't write new codes every day. And so, we're thinking without obviously having a crystal ball and seeing what the future holds. We're thinking, how do you plan for the next 50 years in a logical, sensible way that takes what is already built and finds the patterns in it that make sense. And that may not be a satisfying answer for everybody, but that was really a lot of the logic that went into this. And it was thinking in those kind of time frames.
So I'd like to make a point about what Dave just said. There's a difference in this conversation. There's kind of two threads. One is, can something happen? What are the rules? That these are very fact-based discussions, and it's complicated, and so sometimes we don't all understand it. I think you get a sense that what the Planning Commission tried to do in many of these rule scenarios is operate inside that envelope of what's permitted by the state. And it's almost a game of statistics. How do we make certain things more likely and other things less likely? And although something may not be prohibited, under our current understanding, the odds are very, very low that bad thing, that thing that we kind of think we don't want would happen. And then, Dave's talking about things that are more stylistic in many ways. And, that is what the Planning Commission does. And I think everyone here should feel that they can have a different opinion about those kinds of issues. And that, there's room in the pot for all of those different things to live. I think it's important that we don't take, say, our opposition about something or our favor for something and kind of conflate the two between the facts and the opinions. So,
may I elaborate a little bit?
Go ahead, and then I'm going to call on.
Okay. The planning at this level, 50-year planning, is crystal ball gazing and trying to set up a long-term, most likely scenario over 50 years is hard to do. I mean, when I think back 50 years and I try to put myself back in, what would it be, 1970 something, or was that 50 years ago? And 40, 1960, okay, whatever it is. It's just a moment in time when there's always the ability to foresee with accuracy what's going to happen in 2016 is hard to imagine. I picture myself as whatever it was, a 7th grader or something or other. You know, I couldn't imagine that 50-year time horizon. Yet that's the task that we've set ourselves. At the same time, we're sensitive to your concerns for the 5-year time horizon. What's going to happen? I want to sell my house in the next 10 years and retire to Florida or something like that. We understand that. So on the 5-year time horizon scale or the 10-year scale, the game is to set up strategies that limit the likelihood of the bad things that Aaron just said happen, limit them. So we've set up all these complicated rules that make it very difficult, we think, for developers to come and do the thing that you guys are all, and I am too, afraid is going to happen in my neighborhood. In my neighborhood, Windale Road, the Westchester County of Narberth, really committed, right? It's the most suburban street in town. We have a neighbor of mine has received a contact from a developer interested in speculatively buying their house. He knows their age, he knows that there's a medical condition in the family, and he's hovering like, okay, this is up in La land up here. Okay, this is happening all over town. So we need strategies that are going to fend that off. And I think we've tried to set them up so that the code operates both on the 50-year scale and the 5 to 10-year scale, because we all face the things that you, even in my little Shangri-La street up there, and I freely admit that's what it is. You all face these threats, and they're, as you could have heard last night when many of you were here and heard it. Many of the comments were about pass this code now, pass this code now, pass this code now. The room rang with that because everyone knows that the opportunistic developers are just around the corner. So we all face these threats. That's why we're here trying to get this thing hammered out and get it passed.
One of the other points I would like to make, we all live in Narberth. We love Narberth. Narberth is our world. If we disincent certain development, developers are more likely not to try and figure out a way to do what they want to do in Narberth. They're going to go somewhere else where it's easy to do, where they're going to spend less money on attorneys, less money on architects, less money fighting for a conditional use. There's a whole Philadelphia area out there, and it again adds to the disincentive to do it here. Yes, the property values are high. Yes, there's a lot of good things they can do, but there's a lot of other areas in Philadelphia where someone could choose to spend their money as a business investment, and I think that plays into it. I know I'm guilty of just seeing Narberth as kind of the whole world, and it's really not so. So, who else has not yet spoken?
It's the pearl in the oyster, though, isn't it?
Is that what, oh yes, I promised you, and then, yes, thank you.
I'm Pat Hughes, I live like near the corner, on Chestnut, near the corner of South Narberth. So my first question is about this flyer that I got, which says, the myth is that the Narberth FDC will outlaw my blah, 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 my house, my this, my that. Then it says, fact, no existing buildings or uses will need to change due to their being grandfathered in. Yet someone just said before.
I think it was Mr. Brett.
Grandfather was a dirty word.
I think what he said is that the goal, and I know this was the goal of the thing, to reduce the amount of grandfathering that would be necessary in a new code.
Okay, and I understand that, but I just want to agree with what Jeff said about, you know, as far as the south side, if it could be grandfathered, that we have those apartment buildings and I'll tell you why. It's not like, oh, we don't want anything to change. That is a kids walk to school there. It's already a traffic nightmare. I never see police. I never see anybody patrolling. You have people doing U-turns at the corner of Elmwood constantly. There was a this close to an accident just the other day. You have ballet parents doing all kinds of crazy things. You have little gym parents doing all kinds of crazy things. And we have our children, not mine are grown, but our children, that's where they walk to school. They walk home from school. One of the great things about Narberth is it being a community where children can walk around freely and parents don't have to worry. So adding any more units to South Narberth Avenue, and they're going to be egressing onto South Narberth Avenue as well, right? Because where else are they going to egress onto? That, to me, is not keeping Narberth Narberth.
Okay. That's very well stated.
I'm Walter McDonough, I live on 9, I'm sorry, were you pointing to someone else?
No, go ahead.
Okay.
I'll get to that.
Walter McDonough, I live on 9 Elmwood Avenue, and while I don't live on South Narberth Avenue, I understand the concern of people who don't want that entire street to be zoned so that apartment units would be allowed on every block. But what I don't understand, and I guess this goes to Dave's comment about the spot zoning, how we can't take the 2 apartment buildings that are already there and zone them for apartments because that would be considered spot zoning. But it sounds to me like that's what's being done with the Elmwood Avenue Church under the new plan. That's being specifically targeted to be commercial in an area that's not commercial right now. So that looks equally to me to be a case of spot zoning. So if one thing is spot zoning but that's not, I don't understand the distinction.
Okay. The way that the code includes the church is by looking at civic institutional buildings that were built before 1930. Is that right?
And are large
and are
prominent.
big enough. So in terms of spot zoning, all of the institutional buildings are considered the same throughout the borough. There are not, say, rules for one institutional building and different rules for another institutional building. So I think that kind of addresses in what way it is not spot zoning.
But they're pre-existing, just like the apartments are pre-existing.
They're pre-existing in that they're already there.
Right now, yeah.
That's right.
Just like
And
the apartments are.
that all institutional buildings that meet those criteria of the size and the age, etc., if they wanted to change their use, the new code allows them to transition to a commercial use.
Partially commercial use.
Yes, I think council decided last night that some level of partially commercial use. So, again, all the buildings are being treated the same, versus, I think where Dave was going was saying, we've zoned all of these different areas that have apartment buildings on the block as yellow, but this one block will just carve out the 2 corners. It's kind of then you're actually treating that area differently.
I don't understand that because you would be doing it because of the pre-existing building, the building that's there, that's obviously an apartment building. You're not carving out, you're not creating an exception, it's already there, just like the Elmwood Avenue Church is already there.
It's not the only.
Well, I mean, again, and this speaks to what I was saying about the 50-year window, in that healthy communities need to not be frozen in place. And when we look at where does it make sense to anticipate those changes, those were the places where, again, because of the existing buildings, where they were, especially the apartment buildings on South Narberth, but also the apartment buildings on North Essex and on North Narberth, the thought was that it makes sense for those to have those corridors, as Jim said, because of the width of the streets, the traffic or whatever, but the traffic patterns, but that the criteria in the code, the metrics that would have to be applied to those properties disincentivizes the kind of development that we're all afraid of. And so there was a balancing act between, looking at, a growth pattern that makes sense over the course of decades, and how we organize the code so that it is not easy to do those things that we don't want to have happen. And it's admitting, a very delicate balancing act here, very delicate.
I'm going to call back here. Yeah.
And the number of hours that we spent talking about unintended consequences, you would not believe. Hundreds of hours talking about that.
Yes, sir.
Paul Calvert, 161 Marion Avenue. Are you saying there'll be no non-conforming uses in the borough now? That's sort of what I'm hearing.
I don't know if that's
imagine
literally
possible.
the case.
I think the goal is to reduce the non-conformities. Narberth is.
But you're never going to limit it.
No, of course not.
No,
So why can't we leave those as non-conforming uses there?
I think that
It's not spot zoning.
that comes down to the style.
That's true. It's existing that way today.
That's right.
Well, the zoning map is a diagram of a logic. It's a 50-year logic. I'll just put it out that way. The natural development, the natural lay of the land that God has given us here has certain corridors that are better equipped to handle a denser occupancy than other places. And we can imagine your community of little neighborhood streets that are slow traffic, narrow streets, clogged with parking according to some accounts, that couldn't handle a lot of traffic. And then there's another main basically a thoroughfare that goes through the south side of Narberth, as we have two thoroughfares going through the north side of Narberth that are well capable of handling SEPTA buses and a higher volume of traffic than the little neighborhood streets like Forest Avenue or some little street, Iona Avenue or something like that. So the 50-year plan envisions a higher density of housing in those streets that can accommodate it. That's the 50-year plan. As I said before, the 5-year plan is to provide disincentives to hold off the dense development on all of those streets. So it's a double
I'd just like to
strategy.
I think that's very well explained on both sides, and this falls into that.
I'm not sure
You
that's my question.
you can see it either way, and it comes down to an opinion. It comes down to an opinion of do you want to disincentive it, but kind of have it zoned in a certain way, or there are many of you who feel just take it off the map.
Why do we ever want increased density
why-
there?
what's-
Why would we ever want a SEPTA bus going down that road?
Yeah,
Ever, in 50 years?
No.
If I'm still alive.
Well, we have SEPTA buses on the north side,
I know.
and we have kids walking to school too on the
Okay,
north side.
but that's not
Jen.
why we want to add it.
Rosemary, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to build on Chris's point. There's something very aggravating to those of us on the south side who hear all these plans that density is good for us. We live the way we do for a reason. We like it that way. That's my first point. The other point, I'm sorry if this was already put to bed last night, I wasn't there, but I hope there will be a way to approach this zoning in pieces. There are some very good ideas, and one of the ideas that I think, if I'm understanding it properly, would be a horrible idea, is if we have to revisit whether or not the Elmwood Avenue Church is going to be commercial. We put that to bed, and I am very sad to hear that it's not to bed in this form-based zoning, and I'm just curious to hear.
I would love to shift the conversation to talk about that, because I think last night, those of you who were at the meeting, that's pretty much what it came down to. It comes down to whether we permit commercial use in these civic institutional buildings that are undergoing a change. Now, I know that, just for the record, the document to date says that it would permit 100% use of commercial, and I think everybody agrees that, something that even those on the favor of commercial are saying more like a 50-50, as what was in Ordinance 984, which was defeated. Hear me out. I think it's important also to realize that under the form-based code, if a commercial use was permitted in these institutional buildings, the calculus is a little different than it was under 984, because unlike the existing code where the only tool we have is parking, there's other standards that come to play to further restrict things in the form-based code in terms of maybe the total number of people that could be on site, the type of business that could happen, to allow it to come to a conditional use application. So I think it gives you some more tools if it's in there. I think, I'm just gonna lay it out, and I'd love to see a poll. And I wipe your minds clean. If the choice, and you only have two choices, there is no third choice. If the choice is a possible partial commercial use of the Elmwood Avenue Church, or its demolition and replacement with some form of housing, that, well, let's just say if it were done before the form-based code goes into effect, I think if you take a look up at the tennis courts, you have an idea of maybe what it could look like after the form-based code, more restricted. Which would you choose? So those in favor of, if those are your only two options, having another developer buy it and turn it, let's just take that off the table. If those are your two options, are you in favor of allowing a partial commercial use? All in favor?
But how many people?
Let's say, okay, so let's make it 5 or 6 residences. And if it was demolished, and if it was converted, say 4 units, and maybe 30 people.
Of commercial.
Of commercial, 30 people working in the building. Everybody heard that? There was a little crook. Okay, so again, all in favor of that they would not want any commercial use. Oh, I flipped it. Sorry, I'm being distracted by beeping.
I will vote in favor of no commercial.
Just start again. No commercial use at all. Let the building go. Let them build. You took your hand down.
I think it's a false choice, but...
No, I understand that. This is a hypothetical, theoretical. Because I, as a counselor, need to, and maybe there's things that are going on behind the scenes at some point. I mean, there's not right now, but I need to understand, where do you really stand if those are your only two choices?
Well, call me naive, but wouldn't I love to think that if it was torn down, that our illustrious planning commission would be a little bit more careful as to what went up there, as opposed to that.
The planning commission doesn't make the decision as to what goes up. Under the current zoning code.
Have some control over what would be placed there.
Currently, we would only have the controls in the existing zoning code. I think if you look up at the tennis courts, and actually the developer made many improvements to that plan at our request with no legal obligation to do so.
Imagine those townhouses with garages.
Front-facing, double garages.
Well, it looks like a Section 8 house.
You said it. Okay. $3,600 a month section, but so, again, I'm going to ask the same question because I felt like it was a little disjointed. Let the church be demolished, let it be converted into residences, no commercial use on the south side. All in favor?
Residents.
Okay? And the reverse. Save the building, allow a limited commercial use, and preserve the facade for perpetuity.
Yeah.
Okay.
One last question. Why can't it just be residential the way recent?
I'll tell you, if the current owner chose to do that, and he felt like he could, he wanted to make money, or he didn't care about the money, that's just what he was going to do, or he wanted to sell it to someone who wanted to do that, that is a possibility. But he is under no obligation to do that, and we have no ability to force him to do that.
Could you also just sort of ask him to clean up the property in the meantime? Really, the property is just a disgrace. And if he was trying to, build some goodwill in the community, wouldn't that show just rake it, spend a few bucks, and get somebody over there to clean it up?
I hear you.
Real quick, is there a second firm out there that we should also interview? I hate to just have one and one for a lot of different reasons. So
let's make it 3. How about that?
Well, 3 for 3.
3 firms.
We'll need an RFP.
We'll put ticklers out for 3 firms to give us proposals.
Very good.
It is, although I will point out that it is revenue neutral generally, because applicants are paying fees that directly pay for the individual who's performing the work. But I think we may see some stylistic differences in the way that they come about their tasks. They are all
human beings, even though they're interpreting the code. Okay, so let's put the form-based zoning code on the table. I'd like to go around the room. I'm going to ask each individual counselor. For the public's information, I emailed each counselor and asked them if they had any individual showstoppers, things they would like to change. Nice, I call them nice to haves, but I don't know if that's the right term in this context. That would prevent them from moving forward with the code as it is currently written in the draft 4.0 version, which was recently made available to the public and is on the borough website. And I will start with Councilor Tevin Martha.
Thank you. As I said in my email to Aaron, I don't have any showstoppers. What I do have are some things, I think there's more good here. I think it's been a long process and a thorough process, and I think there are a couple things, clearly going forward I'd like to see adjusted, and one of the things we talk about in, our talk, this is in my crawl a little bit, about porches. I would rather see a set of standard for porches than to say absolutely no enclosed porches. I'd like us to actually maybe have a discussion or set limits or ideas around what it would look like and what we recommend. Like we do with signs, like we do with all the other portions of the code. One of the other pieces that I'd like to see adjusted going forward, but again, not a showstopper, not going to stop me, is that there's, I forget the page, I'm sorry. In the code, it makes reference to, we go currently under the code we are living under currently, a home can be divided into 3 residences, right? 3 apartments, let's say, or 3 individual doors. But in the form-based code, it goes somewhere between 3 to 5. And so what I'd like to say is, and we know this from my experience from New York, is that people were literally, bigger than walk-in closets saying that this is the apartment, and it's $1,200 later. And how do we set that standard for square footage to say this is what constitutes a living space? If we're going to say 3 to 5 living spaces or 3 to 5 dwellings, I want a definition sort of very clearly, not even sort of, definitely, of what we're talking about, so that people don't wind up, living in walk-in closets. So that's my 2 cents.
I'm just going to ask Mr. Muderick for a point of information. Is there anything in the code now that defines the minimum requirements for a dwelling in those divided homes?
The size of the dwelling by square footage? No.
It's in the building code.
Yes.
So when the UCC does, and anyone who were to do, any owner who were to subdivide their building into apartments would have to be inspected by the borough's engineer, and they would be required to conform to the UCC standards, which would be, are basically human standards.
So they're not in this document.
They're not in this document, they exist elsewhere.
They're in the building.
Do you know by chance what that might be? Well, let's just make a point to look that up.
Thank you.
But
Thanks for that. That's helpful. Thank you.
Anything else?
Nope, I'm finished.
Councilor Cillian.
Yeah, so you'd ask, are there any showstoppers, things in the code that are so problematic that you wouldn't advocate passing it as it is? There are none of those for me. I think this document was very thoughtfully done over a very long period and incorporates a lot of compromise among different public positions to the point where it's actually a very conservative document. If you came to it fresh and thought, I'm looking at a purely form-based code that would radically change the way things work from the built environment today, it's not what you're going to find. It's really, I would look at it as more of a hybrid code and very reflective of the way the borough is. And so I really think it creates a much better set point for us than the current code by almost every dimension. So no showstoppers for me. There are a couple issues that I'm a little uncomfortable with, but I think they're all issues that can be handled in further study and what I would call like tweaks within the framework of the code. First, parking, and this is reflective of the fact that it's I would say a hybrid code and very compromised to take into account a wide range of community views. I'm uncomfortable, though, with the inclusion of minimum off-street parking requirements at all. That's section 124-601A, and particularly ones that are still use-based. Section 124-601, that's tables 7 and 8, as you keep in score. Those kind of minimums, rather than maximums, could prevent adaptive reuse and slow down constructive investment, particularly in the downtown area and Montgomery Avenue area, which are areas of more intense use. And those kind of districts in particular, other municipalities have found it more efficient to manage through provision of central shared parking, either public or private. And I don't see anything in the code specifically regarding publicly owned lots or garages, public access to off-street private lots. However, as we've discussed, as a separate exercise, we are coming up with an RFP for a parking study that would address a lot of those issues, whether under the current code or under any adopted code, and I think that's actually the right way to handle it. The parking minimums that are in this document, while they're not the structure that I would like to see, they are much lower than the ones that are in the current code, while still being pretty conservative as a set point. So they're not going to change the world overnight. So I think it's something we can live with while we do our homework and make further tweaks from there. That's one. Two is uses. So again, this is really reflecting the amount of compromise that's built into the code and the fact that it's not a pure form-based code. It has use restrictions all over the place in it. And I'm pretty uncomfortable with how strict those limits on use are, especially outside of the commercial areas, which is again something that could really retard adaptive reuse of existing properties. So for example, and just changes in the use patterns of properties today. So in residential zones, that's what, 3B and below? The only permitted non-residential uses other than family-based childcare, which I'll talk about, just by right uses. The only thing other than residential is what's called a no-impact business. And for those of you taking notes, that's 124.304F, and especially some subsections 2, 3, and 4 require any business that's run out of a house in a residential area to be to only employ residents of the house. So that's a real shame in my view because it prevents home-based businesses from employing any non-family members. So that's really not reflective of how the economy is evolving. So, and I don't think it's compatible with the skills and entrepreneurial character of a lot of our residents. So it prevents, or I would say continues to prevent, because the current code does too, someone from starting a software business, a design business, or like an architecture partnership in their house, and working out of their house with their partner or with a junior employee while they're getting things up off the ground. And really relevant to the historical character of Narberth, it, I think, unless I'm really reading it wrong, would prevent, like, let's say a family-owned plumbing business that's actually operating out of the kitchen office from having an employee who comes in and works like a bookkeeper in their house, right? And that's something you can fix after the fact. It's not going to kill us. It might even be something we could make as a final edit, but it's that sort of use restriction that's really baked into the code all over the place that I think makes it a lot more like a use-based code, and it's probably too restrictive, especially in the residential areas. And also, like, no one running a home-based business like plumbing or something could put any sign outside their house. Or like, let's say you had your law office outside in your house. Even some tiny subset of the signs, they're pretty heavily defined and regulated by 124.605. I think it's something to be looked at. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, is it a deal killer? No. I mean, it's one little corner of a very elegantly crafted document, so it's something I just like to take a second look at. And then, speaking of those kind of uses and opening them up, I would like to see the conditional uses for the larger commercial and institutional properties to open up on the front end. I think I said this in our last meeting, to include uses that are more consistent with their structure: store, retail, bank, general office, restaurant, small restaurant, artist studio. Even, and it's not in there right now, 1 and 2 family residences. I mean, they'd be huge 2-family or 1-family residence, but if someone wants to bring a plan and wants to pay for it, invest in the property and keep it going, why not at least let them bring a plan? You know, the one good thing that did get baked into this new draft of the code is the much tighter restrictions and ability of the planning commission and council to impose conditions on those plans. But it's still quite restrictive on the front end in terms of what kinds of plans can be proposed for those properties as well. You know, when all said and done, it's really a hybrid code, at least as I read it as a non-expert. But it's so superior in so many ways to our current code that I'd be willing to pass it as is and create a new set point and then address these issues with subsequent study and amendment.
Thank you very much. Councilor Richmond.
I agree with a lot of what's been said. I happen to agree we should not mandate, cannot enclose a porch. That's something that.
Sorry, is that in the showstopper category or is that in
It's
the
not
tweak
a showstopper.
category? Tweak.
It's not, yeah, it's a tweak. I'm also not a fan of mandatory pitch roofs.
Can't hear.
You can, you know what, I can hear you. Speak to them.
Okay.
Or pull that microphone up. The only amplified voice.
All right, can you hear me? The first thing I said was that one of the tweaks that I would make is that I would not mandate that you cannot enclose your front porch. The second one that I object to is, I object to mandatory pitch roofs. I think that we should open that up. The one thing that I will say is probably a showstopper for me is that the way that this code is right now, the commercialization on the south side now allows for even greater commercialization than we previously discussed. And that would mean, it would include that the church property can now have 110 people in it and be 100% commercial. I do object to that.
Okay,
And that's it.
thank you. Councilor Wakeberg.
First of all, I just want to say, I'm a fan of form-based zoning, so somebody else out there. We're pretty close on this, but there's 3 or 4, I guess I'll call them showstoppers, things that we don't need to do. It was interesting when Aaron spoke to the public the other night, without the public speaking back. One of the things he said, we don't really need a parking study because all these changes would be slow, dry, incremental, and that would be true if you didn't have an opportunity to have 110 employees in a church, 50 employees in a church, 20 or 30 employees in a church, depending on how we work this out. So if that church property is not an issue of becoming an office now, then the parking plan isn't as critical to be done right away. But if that church property is inviting 20, 50, 100 potential cars within whatever time somebody can come in and do that, we would be remiss not to have a plan to match that if we truly wanted that opportunity, because we don't have a plan. And so that's the first thing about this concept of do we need a parking plan or not. If we're going to let this church property go and be, a Wawa, whatever it could be in this new code, you better have a plan for the cars, because otherwise you're just abusing the people who live in that neighborhood.
I would say that would be the most beautiful Wawa. We'd have to preserve the facade.
It may also have the best parking of any Wawa.
Sorry, go ahead. I'm sorry, I couldn't.
I came up with solutions rather than just showstoppers. I thought one of the issues that's come up is the idea of apartment buildings would now be available to add to certain areas of South Narberth Avenue. And there are, as we know, a few apartment buildings that square shape, which others have pointed out, and I agree completely, that square shape does not add any value of form to me. The density is another question. I don't really have that big of a problem with density. I have a problem looking at a house with turrets and shape being a potential square property.
And just to clarify, are you talking about in the green zone on the south side, or are you talking about the yellow zone?
I'm talking about South Narberth Avenue.
South, yellow zone.
Yeah. And so I spoke with a lot of people who's familiar with this code. A simple solution would be if we were willing, it's something we might want to do down the road. I think there's a lot of objection, community-wise, and I object to it because I just don't think it does what we're trying to do. But we could recolor parts of South Narberth Avenue, include the existing apartment buildings so that we're in compliance, and then the others, we would recolor them to a shade that, or a zone that doesn't allow the apartment building option. So that was the first solution. It's simple. There's this conversation out there, do we, do this in 2 steps or not? This is a tiny step to pull away that doesn't, it resolves this. We can go back to this in 6 months or 6 years. One of the things that's always been said is it's very unlikely to happen. Well, if it's unlikely to happen, why let it be an issue for the community and for others and for myself? The second thing was the
a thoroughfare is Montgomery Avenue or Lancaster Avenue or City Line. That's a thoroughfare. So maybe we don't need to think of it, compare that street of Essex, North Essex to like smaller streets, right? Like Bryce or Dudley. So that would be something that I would say might need to be looked at. That being said, in terms of I don't want to see more density, I do think there needs to be compromise to save assets. And I think the Baptist Church is an asset for this community. All right, so I look at the Friends of Narberth website, and it's cool. You click on the map, and click on all the cool pictures. Every picture I click on, it's not there anymore, right? So at what point are we going to have a building where you click on the picture, and it's still there? All right, and so if we talk about 50 years,
I want to see more cars pulling out of there, more people there. But at the end of the day, what happened there was great. All right, and so it looks beautiful, and so I think there needs to be some compromise in terms of the Baptist Church to save an asset to the entire community, not just South Narberth. So
thank you, and I'm sorry about this step out. Sir.
Hi, I'm Dick Scullin. I live on Beechwood Lane. I back up on Windale. For those of you who don't know what a Beechwood Lane is. I apologize if this has come up before this in previous meetings. Large infill houses or houses that are torn down and built large houses. I'm thinking specifically on the 400 block of Dudley, which is a really nice house, but it's like this close to its neighbors. Would the form-based code address this? Would it have prevented it or changed it in some way?
Yes, one of the parts of the form-based code are called the design standards. The form base is that the massing of buildings that will be permitted on a lot is significantly reduced versus what is currently possible. So that means more green, less building, and also matching setbacks, no front-facing garages, and it even gets into, say, averages of facade versus window, kind of on all the houses in the street. So you couldn't build a glass box that just, didn't fit in, but you couldn't build a fortress that had no windows. All those sorts of things are included. And it's a tremendous improvement over what we have now, in my opinion.
I have one question. Help me with this. In listening to all of these conversations, I get the feeling that we're talking about residential. But how does this form-based code affect the businesses? Because let's talk about the businesses. The majority of the businesses are owned by outside resources. They have been for years. It's no mistake that there are a couple of slumlords that refuse to do any kinds of upgrades I mean, you walk through Narberth, and, I mean, honestly, some of the fronts, the storefronts are just so shabby. Is there going to be any kind of ability to bring the landlords into
I hear where you're going.
this mentality, whatever word I wanted, I can't think of it.
Is there a planning commission member who maybe would like to speak on that, or I don't know that it's addressed?
The code addresses structures that would be built in the future. What you are talking about is property maintenance, which is addressed in the building code, not been attended to, I would say, and I totally agree with you that absentee landlords here and everywhere else, unfortunately, have a tendency to let their properties slide. In public places, that's not only ugly, it's dangerous. I remember standing in the entryway of Duffy Real Estate a few years ago when a bunch of those handsome spiral tiles just cascaded down onto the ground. Dennis took a picture of it. And it wasn't Duffy's fault, it was the landlord's fault who didn't maintain the building.
Well, he bought the building and he did it, and so that's...
Yeah. But that's kind of the problem.
That's the kind of the problem.
In other buildings that you're
The
describing.
bigger problem that we addressed in the code, and we talked a lot about this in the beginning of the process, was what I call the disaster scenario. We already had a tornado blow through here.
Mm-hmm.
What I imagined early on was if something like that, or there was a major fire, and there was once a major fire downtown, would we be able to put back what was there? And it was clear to us very early on when we spent the first couple of years seeing if we could tweak the existing code to make it work. It became very, very clear that we needed to start over. There was no way that the existing code could assure us that we could put back or make sure that what got put back after a disaster like that was what was already there. And Sean did this wonderful graphic of showing how much parking would be required to meet the current requirements of the code. And virtually 3/4 of the downtown would become a service parking lot.
I'm sure. I'm sure.
And so a lot of the rationale
Necessarily. Where this discussion is mostly about the code, I would really suggest reaching out to the Economic Development Committee, coming to a Borough Council meeting, and we could discuss it in more detail.
Because isn't it all part of the picture? Because you're developing, you want this density, you want people to use the downtown.
It's definitely part of the picture.
That's what I'm thinking.
So I think it's totally part of the discussion, because I think what you're touching on is demolition by neglect to a certain extent, right? We're talking about residential homes.
No, that's a good
We've seen it with, one across from St. Margaret's School. I mean, so that's, I think, you were touching on the business piece of it, but I think of more the residential, where there's a fair number of these homes that are like that.
Yes.
And what can we do as a borough to help prevent that from happening? Because once it happens, it's too late, and the reality is the house might get torn down from a public safety standpoint. So that's my other concern, is how does the borough address the demolition by neglect so we don't get into this situation?
I think the best way is for them to be aggressive in making sure that everyone plays by the same rules and that those rules are actively enforced. The borough, in terms of health and safety, in terms of code enforcement. And I think that's an area that we're always trying to improve in the borough administration. I know, for example, the home that's across from St. Margaret's that has the porch that the borough is going to be taking down because the property owner, won't do it. At least that's the last I heard. The odds that home could be saved at this point, it's very, very sad. I'll throw another, the Gleason Center, which was part of St. Margaret's. Mr. Moser, who developed it, and I'll just give him a shout, kudos. He bought that building while the conditional use was not yet approved. He put a new roof on that building because he knew that if he didn't do it, that building was going to come down before anybody could do anything useful with it, and kind of made that financial investment up for, I think, a risk, because he could have very well put the roof on and the conditional use would not have been approved, and then he would have been left with an empty building that was rotted inside with a brand new roof. But I think that unfortunately there are some limits to what, like how far the borough can go, how involved it can get. You know, there have been other properties where people are living there, but they're severely neglected. We've been able to come in on health and safety, dealing with, you know, we don't have a, your lawn can't be this long police, but you know, when your lawn gets to be a certain height, or there's vermin living in the lawn, then, you know, the borough can come in and try and do something about it. You know, we do what we can, but again, there are constraints to how much we can do.
Under the current code.
Under the laws of the state of Pennsylvania. Yeah. Just as an aside, there was a emergency response at one point in the borough a few years back, and you know, seeing the inside of the home made people very concerned. But you know, we're all adults, we're all citizens, and we have the right to have the inside of our home. There were no children involved, you know, and so everybody kind of feels like we should be able to do something, but the law doesn't allow us to do something, and so, you know,
but if you
talk to your
state
senator.
Unsafe. This is like Amtrak. If you see something unsafe, bring it up. Don't let it go by.
That's right. Bring it up to the
Some
borough.
of this has to do with public shaming too. I mean, we're not trying to evict people. There people have real problems in one way or another, monetarily or otherwise. But if you see something and it doesn't seem right, talk about it.
I'm looking for anyone who hasn't spoken. Ms. Bizak?
I was just thinking back to the explanation earlier about the green zone on Elmwood Avenue. From what I remember hearing last night, you talked a lot about zoning for what exists. And the conversation last night was just describing that the reason why those apartments right there are currently zoned for green is in the event of a worst case scenario where one of those apartments burned down, if it was zoned a color other than green, it could never be built to that same number intensity.
That's right.
I think that's how I understood it.
I think that's
so the
right.
reasoning for green was zoning for what exists and recognizing what's there today and knowing if something were to happen there, you could rebuild it the same way today.
Yeah, I mean, that also speaks to the part of the code that is confusing, which is it's for this reason. Oh, it's also for this reason, and it's for this reason and this reason, and then 20 minutes later, you know, Kim remembers one more reason. But it speaks positively to the literally thousands of hours the Planning Commission spent running through every possible scenario to correct.
Planning for new communities, from the ground up communities.
You mean form-based codes? In general.
In general,
Yeah.
you know, the textbook on form-based code really speaks to existing a new community on a bare piece of ground. And as we all know, you know, we have a community that's 98% built up. You know, and it's been discussed already that we don't really have a form-based code. We have a hybrid code that has elements of the traditional Euclid code and the form-based code. And what we really did was take the principles of the form-based code and apply it to a community that's already intact and in place. And there was some messiness to it. And the fact, and if you look at the textbook, it's this nice progression of different zones, you know, that magically just transition very neatly from one to the other, from dense urban core to farmland, you know, with all the right gradients in between. Well, in fact, you know, in the real world, and especially in a place like Narberth that's already built up, it's not that clean and simple. And so there are these little, you know, messy areas.
So I'd like to start wrapping up. We've been here for an hour and a half, a little more. So maybe something new to add, and then I'm going to end with a poll because I would like to kind of get your thoughts.
I wanted to say that a couple of things. The parking that you talked about, trying to make deals with private lot owners, I think would actually go a really long way in adding to business revenue.
Oh, absolutely.
And so that's one way to do it without as much.
I think we're on council, all of us are very excited that we have some interested property owners where their businesses match with, you know, the timings of when people are coming and going. Mr. Martin always used to quote, what was the, that a parking spot is worth a certain amount in business revenue.
$60,000 a year.
So one parking spot equals about $60,000 in sales. You could distribute that amongst the stores if you add up all the spots. If we could add 20 spots, right, wouldn't that be fantastic? Yeah, 50 spots, that would be great.
Right, so I'm thinking that might do some of what the reason for density, for going for more density.
Absolutely.
Is supposed to bring. So I think that should be looked at, what's actually possible there at this time.
That is being actively worked on. We had a parking ad hoc committee. It's been rolled into Public Works. We're moving forward with an RFP for a parking study. That study will be looking at all the potential places, but we actually have some negotiations that are already in the works that may even close before the study finishes. Then the study turns into a plan, and then the plan gets implemented. That's and it takes time. It's government.
The second thing that I wanted to say is I never thought of myself as South Narberth, but I sure do now. And I don't mean as them against us. I mean, we're really looking at different issues. The South Side, if you look at a map, is really small. It's not much bigger than the area that you live in. It's a lot to absorb. We've had traffic, I've been here 26 years. We have had traffic issues on that street. And I think, Bill, you'll remember how long it took to get us a stop sign where kids cross the street. And we were never able to get flashing lights on that street. And when we did, was right when we were able to get this through, was after there were 2 car accidents, one of them 10 minutes before all the kids. It's not just little kids, it's the kids who wait on the corner for middle school, for high school. 2 times, one of them 10 minutes before kids walked out the door, cars ended up on those sidewalks. The stop sign has done some to help that, but what the little gym and the ballet studio, what's happened with that has made it so dangerous. And I looked into the possibility of a community arts center in that space in the very beginning before it was built out. And what I was told is we couldn't do it because it would bring too many cars. I was talking about kids from the area being able to come in and use it. It's a walking community. And
Which property was it specifically?
that was where Mido and Labs,
Okay.
so after McCandless left.
I got you.
And was told couldn't happen as a parking issue. And I've seen what's gone in, and
Was
I think people
that
need,
prior to the establishment of that parking lot on the upper lot? It was prior to
well, that added, 6 spaces, so we talked about that possibility too, but it would be.
I'm just kidding, this is before my time. I'm just
Yeah,
curious.
so I'm thinking, here, it's like, it's almost constant, and during heavier trafficked areas, it's dangerous there. And a new bridge will help sightlines, but it's not gonna get rid of the problem.
No, it would not. You're right.
So I want people to take that really seriously. It's our kids, and I don't want us to wait until somebody gets killed.
I just want to make one suggestion, that there's a big jump between the density in the red zone and the density in the amber zone. Big, and it's, now the density, or the proposed density in the amber zone is now large, it's more than the present yellow zone. So I want to suggest that in certain areas, and one particular would be most of South Narberth, that there could be a zone that was kind of like CAD red light. We're talking about that, orangey red.
We should never have artists describing colors like
that.
that. It's too complicated.
Like, that is less dense than the proposed amber zone, but more dense than the red zone. Because I think that there's not a conformity, but there's a pretty much of a continuity of building types within that area, and in expanding the Amber Zone, you've pulled together a lot of different areas, and the Amber Zone is over quite an area of Narberth, so within that large zone, if you take Narberth as a whole, there are a lot of building types. But in this particular area, and there may be other areas too, I'm just not as familiar, but there's less variety of building types and less density. So I'm just want to suggest that maybe that could be introduced in some cases, and I'm not sure it would make it too complicated, but it might help to, say, distinguish South Narberth Avenue if you made that into the amber orange zone. There could be another zone that was less dense than that on the west, to the west of that.
Okay. No, that's great, and it actually speaks to the fact that although this is a big document, 104 pages, and it's very complicated, and it's before council, let's say that it were to pass in some form, that's not the end.
Yeah.
Right? Council could continue, and I imagine will, with some fairly regular, routine, especially being new. Oh, tweak this, change that, pass this, change that. It's not this thing that's done and then, 50 years it can't change until the clock ticks over again. So I think those are all very interesting suggestions, and I think they all lend themselves to kind of playing out the data, seeing what it is, people sit in a room, they have discussions. It plays into that kind of planning mindset versus I live on the street mindset and all how that works. So I've taken some notes, and I know you've written it also.
Yeah, I have, but yeah.
So it's part of the record. I want you to know that. I'll take one more comment, and then I'll ask two more comments. There were two hands simultaneous. I'll let Mr. Montana end this.
Okay. So really appreciated all the discussion, and it's really great to hear all the views, but I still come back to what I said last night, which is I can see the house at 418 Dudley from my backyard. It just is saddening to see this monstrous thing where there was a really lovely house before. And across the street from me now, the property between the 400 block of Conway and Country Lane, as far as we know for sure, it's not on the county website yet, but that's been sold. Another house has been sold there, I think to the same person. So there's a huge amount of land that's going to be developed. I don't want to see the housing style that's down at the tennis courts. I want to see something that the form-based code will help make it look better than that, help it have less impervious surface. I'm downhill from that. I'm not looking forward to all the water that's going to run. I'm like one of the lowest spots in Narberth. Yeah, it's wonderful. So as much as I recognize this concern that there are things in here that might happen at some point, I'm seeing things that are going to happen right now. And so this just needs to get passed, and then things can be done to it after that. But if we keep holding this up, we are going to see more and more developers swooping in here and doing things that we really don't like. And the south side is just lucky that it hasn't happened over there to you yet. But it's happening to us on the north side a lot. Yeah.
I would say the south side has seen a couple properties that maybe.
You might have, but not in the last.
But just, it's kind of the, don't let perfection be the enemy of the good, like the garbage
I don't think anybody's held anything up either.
No, I don't think she means it in a hostage kind of situation. I think look, in council, we discussed it, this is very complicated. Because we've had discussions outside of me, I think what you're trying to say is move forward.
And let me say this. If there's something that's been torn down on the south side, I haven't heard anything about it. So, and I haven't seen it. And I don't think.
On Marion.
Drive
down Marion.
I was going to say,
drive down Marion Avenue.
Oh,
yeah.
The big huge drainage ditch and.
We won't even tell you where on Marion. You won't need to know.
But I don't think those have happened within the last 6 months. That's what happened.
They just happened. The thing is, we all are concerned.
We totally agree with you.
We totally want you to have that taken care of right away.
Immediately.
Can we do this in 2 parts? I mean, you're
Right.
saying it can't be done,
Let-
but is
let me-
it possible?
Let me
I
call on
agree
Dennis
with you.
here.
Because that's going to start the discussion for another hour.
I
Yeah,
know.
right.
That's true.
No, I just wanted to say that, I mean, and maybe to put a slightly different spin on it. For me anyway, the whole discussion around creating the form-based code, and all of this discussion we're having now. You know,
This is the constructive feedback part. Okay, everyone's got his bit. Learn something? Everyone's saying they learned something, nobody says, oh, well, see, that's good. I learned something, so. Okay, now we'll get to the trickier questions. How many of you would support Borough Council passing the form-based zoning code as it is currently in its draft form? I'm gonna do a count here, because I'm gonna pass this information along. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. And how many no in its current form?
I'd like to see. You could do it in 2 parts, it'd be
6,
right
7,
there.
8. Yeah, I'll count.
If you could do it in 2 parts,
I can,
I'd be so happy.
see the invisible. Okay, and then so my next question, and don't look, I'm just gathering some data here so that we know what to work with. How about a form-based code with the following 2 modifications? And I am making this up, I do not represent anybody, but I'm listening to this conversation, right, and trying to move us all closer together. If the yellow area on South Narberth were to be made amber, and there was a way to have a mixed commercial use in that church with less than 35 employees and 4 residential units. Okay, and then that you would want council to turn down that proposal. 1, 2, 3, 5. And I'm reading you, Kim, that the reason is because you preferred it as is.
I don't think.
How many of you said no because you would just prefer it as is?
As is, which is what?
In its current draft form.
Yeah.
You don't raise your hand. Don't raise your hand. You voted no to my last question because.
I'm sorry, I'm not following.
It's late and you can vote.
well, wait, you can vote more than once in this
I
scenario.
said, you missed your vote, you wanted to vote on number 1, trust me.
Okay, you get it, there.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, I got it. Okay, thank you very much. I will pass this along to the other council members. I think this was a really